I remember walking into the softly lit room, the faint scent of flowers mingling with the chatter of people who all seemed to know each other except me. It was supposed to be a simple pre-wedding gathering, nothing formal, just a chance for my fiancé's friends to meet me and for us all to share a few laughs before the chaos of planning fully took over. I smiled as I approached, trying to blend in. But the moment I cracked a joke, I felt their eyes glance past me, as if I were somehow invisible. And then it happened. One of his friends laughed loudly, a sharp, sneering kind of laugh, and said, "Well, at least he's got a backup fiancé if she ever messes up." I froze, my stomach sank, my hands went clammy, and a slow heat of humiliation spread across my face. I tried to force a laugh, but it came out hollow. A tiny sound that barely masked the ache in my chest. Everyone else chuckled, some nervously, some too easily, and I felt the weight of their amusement pressing down on me. In that instant, I saw myself through their eyes not as the woman he loved, but as a temporary placeholder, expendable if I didn't measure up. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the shadows and let the moment pass. But I couldn't. I could hear my own thoughts spiraling. Was I really not enough? Did he actually have someone waiting in the wings? A knot formed in my stomach, tightening with each laugh that seemed to echo longer than it should. My fiancé looked at me with a small, awkward smile, but he didn't intervene, and I realized that even he might not fully grasp the sting of what had just been said. Every detail became sharper in my mind the way their eyes lingered on me, the casual smirk that suggested this was nothing serious, and yet everything felt personal. My pride bristled against the humiliation, and a quiet resentment began to quill in my chest. This wasn't just a careless joke. It was a reminder that in this circle, I was being measured, judged, and found lacking. I had tried so hard to be perfect, to be charming and agreeable. Yet it seemed impossible to escape their scrutiny. As the evening dragged on, I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, replaying the moment over and over, analyzing every twitch, every glance, every inflection. The laughter that once seemed light now felt heavy, loaded with a subtle cruelty that made me ache with both embarrassment and anger. I wanted to say something, anything, to assert myself, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled politely, nodded at their jokes, and carried the conversation forward with a careful diplomacy I hadn't known I possessed. By the time I left that evening, I felt smaller, quieter, but also more aware. I understood, with a sinking clarity, that this wasn't just a joke about someone else, it was about me, my place, and how little control I had over how I was perceived. And beneath that humiliation, beneath the sting of being laughed at and dismissed, a tiny ember of determination began to glow. I didn't know how yet, but I promised myself, silently, that I would never be underestimated again. That night, as I lay awake replaying every cruel laugh, I realized the story had only just begun. As I tried to shake off the sting of that evening, memories began surfacing, unbidden and sharp. I remembered smaller incidents that, at the time, I had dismissed as coincidence or harmless teasing. The time his friend rolled his eyes when I mentioned my promotion, muttering something about lucky breaks. The way another smirked when I shared a story about my family, as if my experiences were trivial compared to theirs. At the time, I had laughed these moments off, convincing myself I was overreacting, that I was just too sensitive. But now, with the backup fiancé joke ringing in my ears, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I realized that these friends didn't just underestimate me, they actively positioned me as someone disposable, a person whose presence was amusing, but ultimately irrelevant. Their laughter wasn't harmless. It was a quiet declaration of status, a reminder that in their social world, I didn't belong. Every word, every glance that had once seemed insignificant now carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I felt their old frustration rise again, tempered by a simmering anger that was more focused this time. I started replaying conversations in my mind, noticing how they had subtly questioned my decisions, my tastes, my choices, they prided themselves on their exclusivity, their insider knowledge of circles I had barely penetrated. And yet they felt comfortable mocking me in public. Even my fiancé, whom I loved and trusted, sometimes seemed to absorb their opinions a little too easily, nodding along as if their judgment carried more weight than my worth. The realization was bitter. This wasn't about a joke or even about him. It was about how they framed me in their world, the invisible limitations they assigned without my permission. And somewhere beneath the hurt, a spark of clarity began to grow. I understood that if I continued to allow these moments to define me, they would continue indefinitely. Their laughter and whispers weren't casual, they were challenges, opportunities for me to demonstrate who I truly was. The thought of subtle revenge, quiet but precise, took root. I didn't want chaos or destruction. I wanted recognition, respect, and the satisfaction of proving, without fanfare, that I was not to be underestimated. As I traced these patterns, connecting the dots from past dismissals to tonight's humiliation, my mind began to hatch small, deliberate strategies. I imagined social moments where I could subtly assert my intelligence, my poise, my competence. Each imagined scenario brought a small, satisfying thrill, a taste of the empowerment I craved. I didn't need anyone to announce my victories aloud. I wanted them to realize their misjudgment the way I had realized theirs through careful observation, undeniable results, and unshakable presence. By the time sleep finally coaxed me into its embrace, my anger had softened into a quiet determination. I understood the game, and for the first time, I felt the intoxicating possibility of control. No longer would I be just the fiancé to be joked about. I would become someone who commanded attention, respect, and, most importantly, the unspoken acknowledgement that I could never again be dismissed so lightly. Tonight had been a wake-up call, but it was also the beginning of a plan that would quietly, irrevocably, shift the balance of power. The brunch was bright and bustling, the kind of casual Sunday gathering that was supposed to feel warm and inviting, yet I felt a strange tension threading through every interaction. His family was gracious in appearance, smiles plastered across faces, laughter spilling easily across the table. But beneath it all, I sensed the familiar currents of comparison and judgment. I watched as his cousin complimented another woman on her designer handbag, noting how sophisticated she looked, and I felt the invisible measuring stick extend toward me. I tried to smile, to laugh lightly, but each word felt like a quiet jab, a reminder that I was being assessed and, in their eyes, found lacking. The backup fiancé joke crept into my thoughts again, insidious and mocking. I could almost hear it echoing beneath the polite conversation, a shadow running through the room, highlighting every glance that seemed to linger on what I didn't have, every subtle comparison that placed me second. I felt the old tightening in my chest, that same knot of humiliation and frustration from the previous gathering, now compounded by a more painful realization. This was not a one-off event. It was a pattern, a social hierarchy in which I was not at the top. I caught his sister's subtle smirk as I reached for the coffee pot, the way she lingered on her compliment to the other woman while barely acknowledging me. Every small gesture, every passing comment seemed designed to remind me of my place. I kept my composure, nodding politely, making light conversation. But inside, a storm was building. The contrast between the smiles I showed and the resentment simmering beneath was stark. Outwardly, I was calm, approachable, and engaged. Inwardly, I was plotting, taking mental notes, analyzing weaknesses, and noting opportunities. As I sipped my tea, I reflected on how carefully the world had trained me to smile through judgment, to navigate social hierarchies without confrontation. But now, armed with hindsight and awareness, I saw it differently. These microaggressions and subtle favoritism weren't mere personality quirks, they were markers, hints of power structures I could understand and, eventually, manipulate. I could anticipate their reactions, predict their biases, and use their own assumptions against them. By the time the plates were cleared and the conversation moved to mundane topics, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and sharp clarity. I had endured the subtle exclusions, the quiet competitions, and the constant comparisons, but I was no longer just absorbing them. I was learning, gathering insight, and strengthening a resolve that had begun to grow the night of the backup fiancé joke. Beneath the facade of polite conversation and shared laughter, I was building the foundation for the subtle revenge I knew was coming. Outwardly, I left the brunch with a gracious smile. Inwardly, I was sharpening the first edges of a plan that would ensure no one would ever underestimate me again. After the brunch, I found myself increasingly attuned to the rhythms and patterns of his friends, observing them in ways I hadn't before. Social media became my window into their world. The carefully curated posts, the casual captions, the likes and comments that revealed what they valued and, more importantly, who they favored. I noticed how some comments were directed towards certain people with subtle praise, while others, like me, were acknowledged with polite indifference or a hint of derision. It was illuminating, painful, and oddly motivating all at once. At gatherings, I began to study body language and conversational dynamics more closely. Who dominated discussions? Who whispered jokes at someone else's expense? Who positioned themselves as the authority or the insider? Each observation became a piece of a larger puzzle, a map of their hierarchy and unspoken rules. I started taking mental notes, cataloging patterns that might later be useful, all the while maintaining the smile and politeness expected of me. The contrast between the careful, calculating internal observer and the outwardly agreeable fiancé was a rule I wore like armor, protective yet invisible to most. I also experimented with small, strategic maneuvers. At one gathering, I interjected a witty remark at the perfect moment, drawing a genuine laugh without seeming like I was trying too hard. A friend's surprised glance confirmed what I hoped. They hadn't anticipated this display of awareness or intelligence. It was minor, almost imperceptible, but it felt exhilarating, my first subtle victory in a game I had only just begun to understand. That feeling, the quiet thrill of having shifted perception even slightly, fueled my patience and careful planning. Late at night, I scrolled through old group chats, noticing who commented, who ignored, who laughed at what. The patterns were consistent: underestimation, dismissal, favoritism. Yet, in these same spaces, I could see openings for influence, moments where a well-placed comment or thoughtful observation might tilt the scales, even slightly, in my favor. I realized that intelligence, timing, and subtlety could be more powerful than confrontation. Patience became my tool, and observation my weapon. By the end of these weeks of careful study, I felt a growing confidence. I was no longer just reacting to humiliation or judgment. I was understanding the system, seeing its weaknesses, and learning how to navigate it on my terms. Each minor success, each small acknowledgement, added to my sense of agency, and I began to imagine the larger moves I could make when the time was right. The ember of quiet revenge that had flickered during the initial joke now glowed with steady intensity, ready to guide my actions in the chapters to come. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, the kind where nothing seemed particularly consequential, yet everything felt charged with potential. We had decided to meet at a small cafe with a few of his friends, nothing formal, just casual conversation and laughter over coffee. I walked in feeling the usual tight knot of apprehension in my stomach, expecting the same subtle jabs and dismissive glances. But this time, I was prepared not with confrontation, but with quiet, unshakable composure. I reminded myself that every small gesture, every carefully chosen word, could shift perception, even imperceptibly, and that thought steadied me. The conversation began lightly, teasing remarks bouncing back and forth. One friend, with a smirk I recognized all too well, tossed out a joking comment about my supposed clumsiness and my fiancé's backup fiancé options. I paused just long enough to let the joke land and then responded, effortlessly, with a clever, self-assured quip that drew genuine laughter, not derisive, but warm, impressed, and expected. I felt the shift immediately. The smirk faded, replaced by a fraction of surprise, as if I had just unveiled a side of myself no one had thought to consider. Throughout the afternoon, I continued to subtly assert myself. I navigated conversation with charm and wit, asking questions that revealed insight and intelligence, responding with anecdotes that highlighted competence without arrogance. Each word, each carefully modulated tone, built a quiet authority. The friends began to pay attention, leaning in, listening rather than speaking over me. Their previous assumptions that I was merely decorative, easily overlooked, or replaceable were visibly challenged by my presence. Even my fiancé noticed. I caught his glance across the table, a mixture of admiration, surprise, and perhaps a hint of pride. For the first time, he seemed to see me not just as his fiancé, but as someone capable, clever, and socially adept. The realization was subtle, a flicker in his expression, but it mattered more than any applause or overt acknowledgement. This moment marked the first real emotional power reversal. I had quietly reclaimed some authority in a social space where I had previously felt powerless. By the time the outing ended, I walked away with a quiet satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. The joke about a backup fiancé no longer stung as it once had. Instead, it became a challenge I was meeting on my own terms. I didn't need anyone to announce my victory. The small shifts in glances, the softened smirks, the subtle nods of acknowledgement were enough. I had planted the seed of respect, carefully, deliberately, and without fanfare. And as we left the cafe, I felt the ember of quiet revenge grow brighter, fueled not by anger alone, but by the exhilaration of knowing that the game had begun. And for the first time, I was playing it on equal footing. That night, after the laughter and subtle victories had faded into memory, I found myself alone in my apartment, the silence pressing in like a weight I couldn't shrug off. I sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over in my mind. The cafe, the jokes, the fleeting looks of surprise, each moment played like a fragile film strip, looping, twisting, demanding analysis. Despite the small triumphs, a quiet unease settled over me. Was I doing enough? Was I visible enough? Had I really shifted their perception? Or was it just temporary, a flicker before the pattern resumed? I allowed myself to feel the vulnerability I usually bury under smiles and witty responses. The sting of humiliation from the backup fiancé joke lingered, intertwined with memories of past gatherings where I had been overlooked, dismissed, or subtly mocked. I remembered the brunch, the way favors were always given to others, how every small gesture seemed to reinforce my perceived inferiority. For a moment, I felt the familiar pang of doubt, a sense of being tiny in a world that measured me against people who seemed effortless in their confidence and charm. But as I sat with these thoughts, reflection slowly turned into clarity. I realized that this doubt, this discomfort, was not a weakness, it was a guide, a signal of where the imbalance lay, and where attention was needed. Every misstep by others, every slight or dismissive glance, was a data point. I could analyze them, anticipate reactions, and act with intention rather than emotion. I could plan my moves carefully, like a strategist, ensuring that when the time came, I would not just respond, but control the outcome. I began to imagine scenarios in which their assumptions about me would unravel, where their confidence in their social superiority would quietly crumble under the weight of my competence and composure. I pictured myself navigating gatherings, conversations, and social hierarchies with subtle precision, each action a small victory that built towards something larger. In these imagined moments, the ember of revenge burned brighter, no longer fueled solely by hurt, but by purpose, intelligence, and foresight. By the early hours of the morning, I felt a curious mix of exhaustion and empowerment. The vulnerability I had faced didn't feel like weakness anymore. It was the foundation for strategy, empathy, and subtle power. The audience would see me as relatable, flawed, human, someone who felt pain and doubt, yet transformed that vulnerability into careful, deliberate action. And as I finally drifted into an easy sleep, I carried with me a sense of anticipation, knowing that the next steps would be quiet, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Over the next few weeks, I became a careful observer and quiet strategist, turning my attention to the subtle threads that revealed the true character of his friends. At gatherings, I listened more than I spoke, noting the way they boasted about their connections, flaunted privileges, and laughed at the missteps of others. Each anecdote, each casual comment, was a piece of evidence proof of arrogance, favoritism, and a sense of untouchable superiority. I started documenting these mental notes meticulously, storing them like ammunition for a confrontation that was still months away, but growing steadily in my mind. I also reached out in small ways to people who were usually overlooked or dismissed by this circle. A colleague, a friend from a distant social group, even acquaintances I had only met once or twice became allies in subtle ways. Conversations that seemed ordinary were actually opportunities to learn who could be trusted, who had influence, and who might be useful in shifting social dynamics in my favor. Each connection felt like a small victory, a quietly planted seed that could bloom at the right moment. The thrill of these small maneuvers was intoxicating finally. I was moving with intention, not merely reacting to jokes or slights. As the first piece together the puzzle, I began to notice contradictions in their behavior. They preached generosity and fairness, yet I saw favoritism at every turn. They boasted of loyalty and honesty, yet laughed at those they considered beneath them. Every hypocritical moment, every subtle insult, became fuel for my plan. The more I observed, the more I understood that their confidence wasn't built on strength. It was a fragile facade, one that could be carefully dismantled if approached with patience and precision. Anticipation built as I envisioned scenarios where their arrogance would meet its match. I imagined moments at future gatherings, strategic revelations that would quietly unsettle them, subtle shifts in perception that would eventually tip the scales. I held these visions close, letting them simmer, knowing that timing would be everything. I didn't need chaos. I needed precision. Each small observation, each careful connection, each documented inconsistency became a thread in a tapestry of future vindication. By the end of this period, I felt a growing sense of power and inevitability. The ember of quiet revenge, first sparked by a careless joke, had grown into a steady flame. I wasn't just planning a response, I was designing a reversal that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about who truly deserved respect. The tension of waiting, of plotting, of knowing that the first move was mine to make, made every encounter charged with silent electricity. The next step was coming soon, and I could already sense the ripple it would create. The engagement party was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversations that seemed to carry on just above polite whispers. The room was filled with familiar faces, friends, family, colleagues, everyone casually sizing each other up. But I felt more alert than ever, acutely aware of the dynamics at play. I had spent weeks observing, analyzing, and quietly preparing, and now the stage felt set for the first real test of my subtle strategy. My heart raced with a mixture of nerves and anticipation, knowing that tonight could shift perceptions irrevocably. I was mid-conversation, exchanging lighthearted banter with a group I had carefully cultivated as neutral allies, when it happened. One of his friends, the same one who had delivered the infamous backup fiancé joke months ago, leaned forward with a smirk and spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Well, we all know if she ever messes up, he's got a backup, right?" Laughter rippled across the group, and my stomach sank for a fraction of a second, but only a fraction. This time, I was prepared. Instead of shrinking back or forcing an awkward smile, I paused, meeting his gaze calmly. Then, with a small, knowing smile of my own, I replied, "Funny you mentioned that because I noticed how often you worry about what other people are doing instead of focusing on yourself. It's impressive, really, how much energy you put into other people's lives." The laughter around us faltered, replaced by awkward shuffling and murmurs. The smirk on his face faltered, as widening slightly as he realized the jab had landed, though subtly, without a single raised voice. The room's energy shifted immediately. I continued the conversation with casual charm, seamlessly drawing others into the dialogue and gently redirecting attention away from any embarrassment. My composure was effortless, each word measured, each laugh light and natural. I could see the subtle glances, the half-surprised, half-respectful nods from other guests as they registered my confidence. For the first time, the joke that had once humiliated me became the moment that displayed my intelligence, poise, and unshakable control. My fiancé's expression caught mine across the room, a mix of surprise and admiration. I didn't need him to say a word. The look said enough. I had turned the situation on its head, exposing the friend's insecurity and social pettiness without ever raising my voice or appearing aggressive. By the end of the night, I felt a quiet thrill of victory. The ember of revenge had flared into a visible spark, undeniable and satisfying, signaling the first real reversal in a game one was finally playing on my terms. After the engagement party, I began noticing the subtle shifts in how people interacted with me. I didn't need to dominate conversations loudly or call attention to my victories. Instead, I relied on quiet confidence, measured responses, and carefully placed observations that made others pause and reconsider their assumptions. At dinners, brunches, and casual gatherings, I made it a point to listen intently, interjecting only when I could add insight or humor that naturally commanded attention. Each interaction reinforced a new perception. I was no longer just the fiancé they could joke about. I was someone intelligent, composed, and socially aware. I could sense the ripple effects immediately. His friends, once so sure of their superiority, began hesitating, glancing at each other before making a joke, testing boundaries they had once crossed without hesitation. I noticed the microshifts in body language, a pause before speaking, a more measured tone, fleeting uncertainty in eyes that once held only smug confidence. Their previous ease and dominance were subtly eroding, replaced by the faint tension of realizing they were no longer untouchable. The same friends who had laughed at my expense now watched me closely, unsure how to respond to someone who had quietly rewritten the rules of engagement without confrontation. Even my fiancé seemed affected by the change. His admiration grew, tempered by surprise, as he realized that the woman he had always loved was far more resilient and capable than anyone had anticipated. He began deferring to my judgment in social situations, asking for my opinion in ways he hadn't before, his respect deepening with every interaction. It was subtle, but it mattered immensely. For the first time, I felt the power of perception working in my favor, shifting loyalties and altering social hierarchies without overaction. The growing tension among his friends was intoxicating. They whispered, exchanged knowing glances, and second-guessed remarks that might have previously gone unchallenged. I could feel the FOMO creeping in, the anxiety of being overlooked or underestimated finally touching them. Status, once firmly on their side, now wavered, and the realization of my quiet power hung just beneath the surface of every gathering. I reveled silently in the knowledge that the game was turning, that patience and observation were shaping outcomes in ways no one could yet see, and that the first tangible victories were only the beginning of a larger, inevitable reversal. Night of the dinner arrived, seemingly ordinary, but meticulously orchestrated in my mind for weeks. I had invited his friends under the guise of a casual, celebratory gathering, nothing extravagant, nothing that would hint at the subtle shift I had been cultivating. The table was set, warm lights spilling across glasses and plates, conversations buzzing with polite banter. Everyone arrived confident, chatting easily, unaware that the dynamics they had assumed would dominate the evening were about to unravel. I moved through the room with quiet assurance, greeting guests with warmth and charm, all while mentally noting how each friend carried themselves, anticipating the exact moment to unveil the surprise that would shift everything. The conversation began lightly, teasing remarks and familiar jokes bouncing round a table. I let them lead, smiling and engaging just enough to maintain appearances. Then, at precisely the right moment, I casually mentioned an initiative I had been working on, something I had kept private because I wanted the timing to be perfect. "I'm really proud of a project I just launched. It's been a passion for years," I said, letting my tone sound conversational, almost offhand. The pause that followed was electric. I could see eyes narrowing in curiosity, a subtle shift as they tried to gauge the significance of my words. I elaborated just enough to reveal my accomplishment without appearing boastful. A small but influential business I had quietly built, a venture that connected me to people of influence and respect far beyond the circles they assumed were mine. As the realization dawned on them, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Laughter faltered, smiles stiffened, and murmurs began as they processed that the woman they had underestimated, joked about, and dismissed was now someone whose achievements commanded attention and admiration. The social hierarchy they had taken for granted was quietly, irrevocably disrupted. One friend, the same one who had once tossed the backup fiancé joke, froze mid-sentence, eyes widening as the weight of my revelation sank in. Another attempted a light laugh, an attempt to mask embarrassment, but it faltered almost immediately under the invisible scrutiny of the group. I maintained my composure, speaking with ease, letting the revelation breathe and ripple through the room. There was no gloating, no harsh words, only a calm authority that made their discomfort all the more pronounced. Even my fiancé seemed momentarily stunned. But the look in his eyes was different from before. Admiration, pride, and a touch of or shimmer across his expression, reinforcing the shift I had orchestrated. I felt a rush of satisfaction, a quiet triumph that came not from humiliation, but from undeniable validation. For the first time, the balance of power in this circle of friends was visibly altered, and I could sense their recalibration, the way they would never view me or underestimate me again. As the evening continued, the conversation flowed around me, but the air had changed. Every laugh, every glance, every comment carried a new awareness. I was no longer invisible, no longer secondary, no longer the subject of casual jokes. I had orchestrated a subtle, complete reversal, turning their assumptions and dismissive behavior into my moment of empowerment. By the end of the dinner, I walked away with a sense of vindication so profound it made my chest ache, not from anger, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had claimed my space, my respect, and my power, all on my terms. The ember of that first humiliation had become a blaze of triumph, and the story I had begun months ago had reached its first undeniable, spectacular peak. A week after the dinner, I found myself at another gathering, this one hosted by mutual friends with a larger crowd and a casual, open setting. The energy was lighthearted on the surface, but I had been preparing for this moment, knowing it would be the stage for the confrontation I had envisioned for months. My patience, observation, and subtle victories had all led to this. The friend who had mocked me with the backup fiancé joke months ago was present, laughing easily, unaware that the quiet, composed woman he had once dismissed was no longer someone to be trifled with. As the group's chatter ebbed and flowed, I positioned myself strategically, engaging in conversation with neutral acquaintances before calmly steering the dialogue toward the topic that mattered. I waited for the precise moment when the friend's smugness peaked, when he assumed his social dominance was unquestioned. Then, in a tone that was calm yet edged with authority, I addressed him directly, recounting the backup fiancé comment word for word. My voice carried evenly across the room, neutral yet deliberate, exposing the joke not with anger, but with a quiet precision that highlighted the cruelty beneath the humor. The room went still for a fraction of a second, and I could feel the collective awareness shift. Eyes widened, murmurs started, and the friend's confident demeanor faltered. He tried to laugh it off, but the effect was gone. The audience now saw the arrogance and insensitivity that had been hidden behind casual smiles and past jokes. I continued, outlining how his words and behavior reflected a pattern of underestimation, favoritism, and disregard for those he deemed inferior. Every example was precise, undeniable, and calm, leaving no room for deflection. My tone was firm but composed, demonstrating moral authority rather than malice. And the contrast between my poise and his faltering confidence was electric. As I spoke, I noticed the subtle physical cues of humiliation, the flush on his cheeks, the tightening of his jaw, the uneasy shifting of feet. Friends who had previously laughed along with him now exchanged glances, some nodding slightly in agreement, others whispering behind cupped hands. My fiancé watched quietly, admiration clear in his expression, as he observed not only my composure, but the undeniable force of my presence. The social hierarchy that had once been assumed was unraveling in real time. The confrontation reached its peak when I casually highlighted my recent accomplishments and the respect I had earned from others outside of their circle. It wasn't gloating, it was simply undeniable truth. The room absorbed the contrast, the friend's arrogance versus my calm, capable authority, the years of underestimation versus the tangible results of patience and strategy. The friend's previous dominance was reduced to self-consciousness, a public exposure of insecurity that needed no embellishment. By the time I concluded, the murmurs had grown into quiet admiration, and the shift in perception was complete. Leaving the gathering, I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. The ember of humiliation that had once burned so painfully had transformed into a flame of triumph, illuminating the difference between quiet confidence and superficial bravado. For the first time, the reversal was absolute. I had reclaimed control, earned respect, and exposed arrogance in a way that was both public and morally undeniable. My patience, observation, and careful planning had culminated in this climactic moment, and the satisfaction of seeing justice served without sacrificing my dignity was intoxicating. The game had reached its apex, and I was standing firmly at the center, unshakable, triumphant, and fully empowered. Later that evening, after the social tension had settled and the group began to disperse, my fiancé pulled me aside. His expression was a mixture of surprise, admiration, and something more vulnerable, regret. I could see the weight of realization settling in as he reflected on the events that had unfolded, how the friends' careless jokes and subtle dismissals had affected me, and how I had navigated the entire evening with grace and unshakable composure. For the first time, he seemed to understand the depth of both the humiliation I had endured and the quiet power I had cultivated. He spoke softly, words deliberate and thoughtful. He acknowledged how cruel the jokes had been, the ways his friends had underestimated and undermined me over time. There was a sincerity in his voice that made me pause, realizing he was truly seeing me not just the fiancée he loved, but the woman I had become through patience, strategy, and resilience. I didn't realize how much they had affected you, he admitted, his tone tinged with regret. And I didn't fully appreciate how strong and intelligent you are, how much you've handled with such grace. Hearing his acknowledgement brought an unexpected warmth, a validation I had craved silently for months. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, the knots of past humiliation unraveling slightly, replaced by a quiet pride. The patience, careful observation, and subtle victories I had cultivated were finally recognized by someone whose opinion mattered most. His admiration was tangible, a gentle affirmation that my actions had not only protected my dignity, but also earned respect in both social and personal spheres. As he continued to express his understanding, I realized that this moment was more than just apology, it was emotional closure. I had been underestimated, laughed at, and dismissed, yet through calculated patience and quiet strength, I had transformed the dynamic entirely. His recognition wasn't performative. It was authentic, rooted in the realization that I had consistently shown intelligence, composure, and moral authority while navigating cruelty and arrogance with skill. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of relational validation, a confirmation that my efforts and resilience were seen and respected by someone whose perspective mattered. By the time we rejoined the remaining guests, I carried a quiet satisfaction, a sense of empowerment that extended beyond the social reversals or public vindications. The ember of my initial humiliation had grown into a steady flame, fueled not just by revenge, but by personal growth, recognition, and the acknowledgement of my inner strength. My fiancé's admiration and understanding made the journey feel complete, not because the friends had been exposed, but because my dignity, patience, and intelligence had been validated in the eyes of someone who mattered most. The journey that had begun with a careless joke had led to a moment of profound emotional closure and relational triumph later that night. After the guests had gone and the apartment had fallen into a soft, peaceful quiet, I sank into my chair by the window, letting the events of the past months wash over me. The laughter, the jokes, the subtle humiliations, all the moments that had once felt like sharp arrows now seemed like necessary steps in a journey I had undertaken for myself. I traced the path from the backup fiancé joke to the quiet, deliberate victories I had orchestrated, and a sense of satisfaction swelled within me. I had endured, observed, learned, and acted, and every small triumph had led to this moment of clarity and empowerment. I thought about the times I had doubted myself, when my insecurities had whispered that I wasn't enough, that I was too small or too inconsequential to matter. Those whispers had been loud and relentless, but through patience, careful observation, and deliberate action, I had transformed that vulnerability into a quiet strength. I realized that the real victory wasn't simply in exposing the arrogance of others or in public moments of validation. It was in the internal shift. The way I now carried myself with unwavering confidence, grace, and awareness. The ember that had sparked a humiliation had become a steady flame of self-assurance and purpose, reflecting on the confrontations, the social maneuvers, and the subtle power reversals. I felt a profound sense of growth. I had navigated a complex web of relationships, shifting dynamics, and unspoken hierarchies, and emerged with dignity intact. There was a bittersweet quality to the journey. The pain and humiliation had been real, and the scars they left were reminders of the lessons I had learned. Yet, even those reminders were comforting, proof that I had endured and grown stronger, that I had claimed agency over my own narrative when others had sought to define it for me. In the quiet of that evening, I allowed myself a small, private smile. I didn't need accolades or recognition beyond this moment. The satisfaction came from within. I had proven not only to them, but to myself that resilience, intelligence, and composure could overturn assumptions, transform social dynamics, and create a sense of empowerment that was deeply personal and enduring. The backup fiancé joke no longer haunted me. It had become the catalyst for growth, strategy, and eventual triumph. As I looked out at the city lights, I felt a quiet pride in my journey, in the subtlety of my victories, and in the emotional justice I had carved out for myself. This was a victory without noise, without fanfare, but it was complete. I had transformed humiliation into strength, underestimation into recognition, and doubt into clarity. In the silence, I experienced the deepest satisfaction, the knowledge that I had emerged not just victorious, but fundamentally changed, wiser, and unshakably self-assured. The story ended not with chaos or revenge, but with the quiet triumph of someone who had faced doubt, injustice, and cruelty, and had risen above it, whole and empowered. In the stillness of the days that followed, I reflected on everything that had transpired: the jokes, the subtle humiliations, the quiet victories, and the ultimate reversals. Each moment had been a lesson, each slide a teacher, and I realized that the journey wasn't just about proving others wrong. It was about discovering my own strength, intelligence, and self-worth. I had learned that dignity isn't given, it's maintained through patience, observation, and the courage to act decisively when the moment is right. The fire that had once been fueled by embarrassment had transformed into a steady flame of empowerment that no one could extinguish. I also understood the importance of strategic patience. Every minor victory, every carefully considered maneuver, had been part of a larger plan. By waiting, observing, and letting others reveal their own weaknesses, I had gained the advantage, not through aggression, but through intelligence and timing. This wasn't about public humiliation for its own sake, it was about reclaiming my space, earning respect, and asserting value in a world that had once underestimated me. The sense of control I now felt was profound, and it was grounded in deliberate, thoughtful action rather than impulse. Another key lesson was the recognition of my worth. The experiences I had endured had initially left me questioning myself, doubting whether I belonged, and wondering if I could ever command the respect I deserved. But through each confrontation, subtle reversal, and ultimate reveal, I came to understand that my value was inherent, independent of anyone else's approval. The friends who had once wielded social power over me now found their influence diminished, their jokes powerless against the quiet authority I had cultivated. They could no longer define me, nor could they diminish my accomplishments or integrity. As I looked forward, life felt markedly different. I navigated social spaces with confidence and clarity, aware of who I was and what I deserved. I no longer allowed subtle dismissals to sting, nor did I feel the need to prove myself to those who had already revealed their own pettiness. Relationships were now guided by mutual respect and genuine admiration, and I approached each interaction with a calm assurance that had been hard-won but deeply satisfying. The journey had given me not only a sense of empowerment, but also emotional justice, a quiet, internal victory that required no external validation. Reflecting on the story as a whole, I understood that empowerment comes from within, and that emotional justice is achieved not through chaos or anger, but through strategy, resilience, and self-awareness. I had turned humiliation into insight, underestimation into opportunity, and doubt into clarity. The path forward was mine to define, guided by the lessons I had learned, the victories I had quietly earned, and the unshakable understanding of my own worth. In the end, the story closed not with drama or revenge, but with quiet confidence, satisfaction, and the knowledge that life could, finally, move forward on my terms.